Welcome to a story that will challenge your perception of justice, truth, and the shadows lurking just beneath the surface of our lives. Every story has a beginning. Perhaps it starts with a whisper, a fleeting glance, or a shocking event that changes everything forever. These stories are not merely narratives. They are mirrors reflecting ourselves, our deepest fears, and the resilience of the human spirit. Sometimes, the most terrifying tales are the ones that expose the fragility of order and the ever-shifting nature of evil. They force us to confront unsettling questions. How can one individual inflict such terror? What drives a soul to that abyss? And when those shadows linger, do we truly see them, or are we blinded by the dazzling light of everyday life? The story you are about to read is one of those. It will take you down dark alleys, deep into the mind of a predator, and into the tense heart of a city under siege. It is an exploration of fear, endurance, and the fragile threads that bind us together. If you are ready to descend into this abyss and witness the rise of one of America's most infamous horrors, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this is a story you won't want to miss, one that will stay with you long after the final page is turned. And now, let the story begin. Averil City, a sprawling metropolis where the glint of ambition met the grime of forgotten dreams, had always prided itself on its resilience. It was a city of steel and glass, of countless lives interwoven into a complex tapestry of commerce, culture, and relentless progress. But beneath the polished facade, in the quiet corners and the shadowed alleyways, something was stirring, something ancient and predatory. The first whispers began not with a bang, but with a chilling, almost imperceptible tremor. It started with Eleanor Vance, an octogenarian recluse whose passing in her modest, flower-filled apartment was initially attributed to natural causes. She had lived a quiet life, rarely venturing beyond her well-tended window boxes, her world a delicate ecosystem of faded photographs and the scent of lavender. Detective Sarah Jenkins, a woman whose cynicism was a well-earned shield against the city's endless parade of human misery, felt a prickle of unease. There was no forced entry, no struggle, just Eleanor, serene in her armchair, a cup of lukewarm chamomile by her side. Yet, something felt wrong. It was the immaculate state of the apartment, almost too perfect, and a single meticulously preserved dried crimson rose, placed not in a vase, but gently on Eleanor's closed eyelids. The medical examiner, a harried man named Dr. Eris Thorne, dismissed it as a post-mortem eccentricity, perhaps by a visiting relative. But Jenkins, with her gut-deep instinct honed by 2 decades on the force, couldn't shake the image of that rose. It felt less like a gesture of grief and more like a signature. Her partner, Detective Mark McKinley, a younger, more idealistic officer whose enthusiasm was still largely untainted, chalked it up to Jenkins' overactive imagination. "Come on, Sarah," he'd said. The woman was 87. Her heart probably just gave out watching daytime TV. But Jenkins had seen enough death to know the difference between an ending and a punctuation mark. 2 weeks later, the punctuation mark became undeniable. Mikey O'Connell, a transient known to frequent the Lower East Side's soup kitchens and alleys, was found in a narrow service lane behind a bustling district of upscale eateries. Mikey's life had been brutal, a canvas of hardship and neglect, and his death reflected that. He had been beaten savagely, but with a strange, almost clinical precision. His broken body lay amidst discarded takeout containers and graffiti-scarred brick. And there it was again. A single, perfectly preserved dried crimson rose, tucked into the tattered lapel of his threadbare jacket. This time, Dr. Thorne's dismissive attitude evaporated. 2 victims, 2 vastly different lives. One chilling, identical detail: Averil City had a killer. The news spread like wildfire, igniting the tinderbox of public anxiety. Initially, the media struggled to connect the dots between an elderly recluse and a homeless man. The initial headlines were tentative: "Mystery deepens in Averil City deaths. Is there a link?" But as the police department confirmed the identical forensic signatures, the specific type of rose, the absence of defensive wounds despite the obvious violence in Mikey's case, suggesting incapacitation before the attack, and the peculiar, almost ceremonial placement of the flower, the tone shifted. Panic began to set in. The Crimson Rose Killer was the name the tabloids coined, catchy and macabre. The more serious news outlets, attempting to maintain decorum, simply referred to the perpetrator as the Averil City Slayer. But the fear was real, palpable in the hushed conversations on subway platforms, the nervous glances exchanged on crowded streets. Jenkins and McKinley, now officially leading the task force, found themselves drowning in an ocean of conflicting information and dead ends. The victims had no apparent connection. Eleanor Vance lived a life of quiet solitude, sustained by a meager pension and the memory of a long-dead husband. Mikey O'Connell was a ghost in the urban landscape, his past a blur of shelters and street corners. Their only commonality was their extreme vulnerability and, now, their gruesome fate. It's like he's picking people no one will miss, McKinley mused, flipping through case files in their cramped office, the fluorescent lights humming an oppressive drone. No families banging down our doors. No public outcry for justice. Just gone. Jenkins stared at a panoramic photo of Averil City, the twinkling lights of skyscrapers mocking the darkness she was delving into. That's precisely why we have to work harder, Mac. Because someone has to miss them. Because someone has to speak for them. Her voice was low, filled with a resolve that felt like granite. The task force quickly expanded, bringing in experts from various fields. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned criminal profiler from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, was flown in. Reed was a woman of sharp intellect and an even sharper wit, her eyes piercing and analytical. Her initial assessment painted a disturbing picture. We're dealing with an organized offender, highly intelligent, meticulous to a fault. The rose isn't just a signature. It's a message, a symbol. He controls the scene, almost curates it. The lack of defensive wounds in both cases, despite the disparate methods of death, suggests a sophisticated approach to victim selection and incapacitation. He wants total control. He views his victims not as individuals, but as representations. Representations of what? Jenkins pressed, leaning forward, her gaze locked on Reed. Reed tapped a pen against her chin. That's the million-dollar question, detective. But consider the victims. An elderly shut-in, a homeless man, both on the fringes. Invisible to the grand machinery of Averil City. He's choosing those whom society has, perhaps, already forgotten. There's a twisted sense of poetic justice in his actions, a perverse moral code. He's not just taking lives, he's making a statement. He wants to be seen, and he wants his victims to be seen in death in a way they never were in life. The profiler's words sent a chill down Jenkins' spine. It wasn't just random violence. It was targeted, purposeful, ideological. This wasn't a monster driven by blind rage, but by a chillingly rational, albeit deranged, philosophy. As the days turned into weeks, the city held its breath. People began to look at their neighbors differently. Suspicion festered. The vibrant pulse of Averil City began to falter, replaced by a nervous flutter. Restaurants were less crowded at night, parks emptied early. The city that never slept was suddenly afraid of the dark. Then came the third victim. This time, the target was unexpected, throwing the investigators into further disarray. Samuel Sam Peterson, a junior architect, young, ambitious, and seemingly well-connected, was found in his sleek, minimalist apartment in the trendy West Loop district. He wasn't on the fringes, he was a rising star. Yet, the scene was eerily familiar. No forced entry, no struggle, a clean, almost surgical kill, and the ubiquitous dried crimson rose placed on his chest. The media frenzy exploded. A young professional. This changed everything. The Crimson Rose Killer wasn't just targeting the vulnerable. He was targeting anyone. The public outcry reached a fever pitch. The mayor held an emergency press conference, promising every resource to catch the killer. But his words rang hollow against the rising tide of fear. Jenkins felt the weight of the city pressing down on her. The public demanded answers, and they had none. Eleanor, Mikey, Sam. 3 vastly different lives, brutally cut short, linked only by a single blood-red flower. Reed's profile had to be wrong. Sam wasn't on the fringes. He was at the center of the city's ambition. But as Jenkins stared at Sam Peterson's file, a detail, seemingly insignificant, caught her eye. Sam had recently been laid off from a prestigious architectural firm after a controversial project he spearheaded fell through. A massive urban development that would have displaced several low-income communities. He had been deemed responsible for the PR disaster, quietly sidelined. He was, in his own way, suddenly on a different kind of fringe, a professional pariah, a casualty of corporate politics. He was no longer rising, he was falling. And then it clicked for Jenkins, a horrifying realization. The Shadow Weaver, as Reed had started to call the killer in her internal reports, wasn't just targeting the forgotten. He was targeting those who had been silenced, cast aside, or had lost their voice, regardless of their social standing. Eleanor Vance, lost in her own quiet world. Mikey O'Connell, whose voice had been extinguished by poverty and neglect. And Sam Peterson, whose career, and thus his professional identity, had been abruptly, brutally silenced. He wasn't just making them seen in death. He was giving them a voice, a terrifying, crimson-stained voice that echoed through the panicked streets of Averil City. The killer, in his deranged mind, was giving these victims a final, unforgettable presence. And as Jenkins gazed out at the city lights, she knew one thing with chilling certainty. The Shadow Weaver was just getting started. The first thread had been pulled, and the entire tapestry of Averil City was beginning to unravel. The killer, meanwhile, watched the news reports from the anonymous comfort of his apartment, a ghost in the machine of the bustling city. Elias Thorne, a name known to almost no one, a face easily forgotten in a crowd. He traced the outline of a dried crimson rose with a gloved finger, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. They were beginning to see, slowly, painfully, they were beginning to see the shadows he had always known existed. And the fear, oh, the beautiful, blossoming fear. It was precisely what he intended. For Averil City had long been blind, and he was here to force its eyes open. He was here to weave a new narrative, one stitch at a time, in crimson thread. The weeks that followed Sam Peterson's murder plunged Averil City into an abyss of fear and paranoia. The Crimson Rose Killer, now universally dubbed the Shadow Weaver, by the press, a term that chillingly resonated with Dr. Reed's profile, had moved beyond the fringes, demonstrating a chilling versatility in his victim selection. Public spaces emptied after dusk. Schools implemented stricter security protocols. The once bustling nightlife died down, replaced by a nervous quiet. The city, a behemoth of vibrant activity, now felt like a giant holding its breath. The pressure on the Averil City Police Department was immense, a suffocating blanket of political demands, media scrutiny, and public desperation. Mayor Thompson, usually unflappable, looked visibly strained at daily press conferences, his assurances of impending arrests sounding increasingly hollow. FBI agents descended upon the city, their presence a double-edged sword, providing resources but also adding another layer of bureaucracy and jurisdictional squabbles. Jenkins and McKinley, at the eye of this storm, felt the weight of every unsolved minute, every terrified citizen. Reed, with her unervingly calm demeanor, continued to refine her profile. He's escalating, not just in frequency but in audacity, she observed, gesturing to a meticulously constructed timeline of victims and their associated clues. He's becoming more confident, almost taunting us. The victims are still connected by a sense of being silenced or erased in some way, but the definition is broadening. He's pushing boundaries. The fourth victim was Sarah Chun, a brilliant young investigative journalist who had been working on a controversial exposé about corruption within the city's urban planning department. She was found in her meticulously organized home office, surrounded by stacks of research and a laptop open to an unfinished draft. The single crimson rose, this time, was pressed between the pages of her notebook, marking a particularly damning piece of evidence she had uncovered. Sarah Chun had not been silenced by society, but by a powerful, entrenched system. The Shadow Weaver had merely finished the job, twisting her murder into a macabre statement against the very forces she fought. Jenkins slammed her fist on the table, the frustration a bitter taste in her mouth. He's evolving, damn it. How do we get ahead of him if his profile keeps shifting? It's not shifting, Detective Jenkins. It's deepening, Reed corrected calmly, her eyes fixed on the evidence board. He's not just targeting the forgotten, but anyone whose voice or narrative has been suppressed, discarded, or overwritten. He sees himself as a grim archivist, preserving these silenced stories in blood and roses. Sarah Chen's murder is a calculated act, not just of violence, but of commentary on the very power structures of Averill City. The realization sent a fresh wave of dread through Jenkins. This killer wasn't just a murderer. He was a dark artist, painting a horrifying critique of society with human lives. The investigation was a labyrinth of false leads and dead ends. Hundreds of tips flooded the hotline, most of them useless. Every person with a grudge, every individual who owned a rose bush, became a suspect. Mac, ever the optimist, tried to find patterns in the mundane, tracing the origins of the roses, the type of soil they grew in, the specific nurseries that sold them. But the roses were common, easily acquired, and left no unique forensic trace. The killer was too careful, too precise. One evening, a glimmer of hope, quickly extinguished, arrived. A young woman, Maya Rodriguez, a barista working late, had witnessed something. She had been taking out the trash behind her cafe when she saw a man, tall and slender, with an almost unnerving stillness, emerge from an alleyway near where Sam Peterson's apartment was located. He carried a small, nondescript satchel and moved with a fluid, almost predatory grace. She hadn't seen his face clearly, only a fleeting impression of dark clothing and a peculiar way he held himself, as if constantly observing. Maya, however, was terrified. She was new to the city, living paycheck to paycheck, and the thought of getting involved with a serial killer sent shivers down her spine. It took Jenkins and Mac days of patient, convincing, promising protection to even get her to describe him. Her description was vague. Average height, average build, dark coat, a certain emptiness in his eyes, even from a distance. It was enough for a sketch artist, but the resulting composite was maddeningly generic, a face that could belong to 1,000 men in Averill City. It was another dead end, another thread that frayed before it could lead anywhere. The killer, meanwhile, continued his gruesome work. The fifth victim was an elderly librarian, Margaret Finch, who had recently been forced into early retirement after a controversial budget cut led to the closure of her beloved community library branch. The sixth was a young, gifted street artist, Leo Canvas Morales, whose vibrant murals had been repeatedly defaced and painted over by city officials who deemed his work unlicensed vandalism. Each murder was a chilling echo of Dr. Reed's profile, a testament to the Shadow Weaver's twisted moral compass. Reed's insights grew sharper, more disturbing. He's meticulous in his selection, but also becoming more daring. The locations are more public, the risks higher. He's reveling in the chaos, detective. He sees himself as a teacher, and Averill City is his classroom. He's making us confront the invisible, the discarded, the silenced among us. Every murder is a sermon. Every rose, a bloody sacrament. Jenkins started to notice subtle patterns beyond the victim's silenced status. She spent sleepless nights poring over victim files, looking for anything, any obscure connection. Eleanor Vance's apartment was near a derelict community center that had once offered free art classes. Mikey O'Connell had often panhandled near a monument dedicated to forgotten civic heroes. Sam Peterson had overseen a project that would have demolished a historic, albeit struggling, neighborhood church. Sarah Chen had been investigating a land deal involving the same urban planning department that had approved the library closure and the mural censorship. Margaret Finch had fought to keep her library open. Leo Morales had seen his art erased. It was a thread, thin but persistent, that wove through forgotten spaces, neglected causes, and overlooked histories of Averill City. All victims, in some way, were connected to the physical spaces or communal institutions that defined the city's struggling soul. the places that were being quietly eroded, silenced by progress, or simply forgotten. He's not just targeting people, Jenkins declared one morning, a fresh surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. He's targeting the city itself. He's making a statement about what Avril City is losing, what it's choosing to ignore. Every victim is a symbol of a forgotten piece of this city's heart. Mac looked at her, his eyes wide with comprehension. The community center, the monument, the old church, the library. They're all places that tell a story, Sarah. Stories that are being erased. Exactly, Jenkins affirmed, pointing to a map of Avril City now dotted with pins marking the victims' last known locations and the associated, forgotten spaces. He's targeting the guardians of those stories, the people who embodied or defended those places, or who were directly harmed by their erasure. He's weaving a narrative of neglect and loss. The Crimson Rose Killer isn't just a serial killer. He's an avenger for the soul of Avril City. Reed nodded slowly, a glint of grim satisfaction in her eyes. A profound insight, detective. It explains the diversity of victims and the meticulous staging. He is not just killing. He is memorializing a grievance. His motivation is a twisted form of urban preservation, a violent protest against what he perceives as the city's moral decay and forgetfulness. This new understanding, while terrifying in its scope, finally offered a direction. They started digging into the history of these forgotten places, searching for common threads, for individuals who might have had a deep, personal connection to all of them. Someone who felt truly betrayed by Avril City's relentless march forward. Someone with a deep-seated grievance, an intimate knowledge of the city's hidden wounds. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne, the man behind the terrifying moniker, sat in his sparse apartment, surrounded by maps of Avril City, each marked with intricate symbols and dates. He observed the spreading fear with a detached, clinical satisfaction. They were getting closer, the detectives. He could feel their frantic energy, their desperate attempts to understand. Good. Let them struggle. Let them see the rot beneath the veneer. He was forcing them to look, to truly see the forgotten. He was making Avril City remember. And soon, he would offer them his grand finale, a crescendo of crimson that would ensure no one would ever forget the price of their neglect. The tangled weave was far from finished. In fact, the most intricate, most painful knots were yet to be tied. He smiled, a cold, empty expression, and reached for another perfectly dried crimson rose, its petals soft as velvet, its color the shade of spilled blood. The next sermon was already being prepared. The revelation that the Shadow Weaver was targeting not just individuals but the very soul of Avril City electrified the task force. The FBI, initially skeptical, now saw the profound psychological depth of the case. Jenkins, Mack, and Reed became an inseparable unit, driven by a new, urgent purpose. They delved into the city's archives, poring over decades of urban planning documents, community meeting minutes, and forgotten local news reports. They were looking for a specific kind of trauma, a collective wound that could connect the seemingly disparate threads. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, an obscure, privately funded historical society led by a tenacious amateur historian named Martha Davies. Martha had spent her life documenting the overlooked stories of Avril City, focusing on the communities and landmarks that had been erased by progress. She pointed them to the Old Mill District redevelopment project of the late 1990s. It was a massive urban renewal initiative that promised revitalization but ultimately bulldozed a historically significant, tightly knit working-class neighborhood, displacing thousands and destroying countless small businesses and community hubs, including the very community center Eleanor Vance's apartment overlooked, the monument Mikey O'Connell frequented, and the old church Sam Peterson's firm had planned to raise. It was a bloodbath, metaphorically speaking, Martha explained, her voice heavy with remembered grief, leafing through yellowed newspaper clippings. Families torn apart, promises broken, people left with nothing. The city promised new housing, new jobs, but it never fully materialized. Many simply vanished, leaving their homes, their histories, behind. Reed's eyes glinted. A mass silencing, a collective erasure. This is it. Jenkins felt a jolt of recognition. And the victims. Eleanor Vance was a longtime resident of the Old Mill District, one of the last holdouts before she was forced into a city-subsidized apartment. Mikey O'Connell's family lost their home there. His mother died shortly after the displacement. Sam Peterson's firm was directly involved in the modern-day continuation of that same kind of predatory development. Sarah Chun was investigating a modern land grab rooted in the Old Mill District's legacy. Margaret Finch's library branch was the last vestige of community support in a new development that failed to account for social infrastructure. Leo Morales murals were a defiant act of remembrance, painted over by city officials who wanted to forget. The pattern was undeniable, horrifyingly precise. The Shadow Weaver wasn't just grieving for lost places. He was avenging a lost community, a buried history. He was targeting those connected to its initial destruction and those connected to its continued modern-day erasure. "We need to find someone who lived through that," Mac urged, his finger tracing the faded map of the Old Mill District. "Someone who lost everything. Someone who felt the deepest betrayal." The deep dive into the Old Mill District files led them to Elias Thorne. His name surfaced in a list of displaced residents, a young boy at the time, whose family had owned a small, beloved bakery in the heart of the district. The bakery, Thorne's Daily Bread, had been a community pillar for generations. The boy, Elias, then 11 years old, had delivered bread, played in the community center, attended services at the old church. His family fought tooth and nail against the redevelopment, losing everything in the process. His father, overwhelmed by financial ruin and heartbreak, had died by suicide just months after their forced relocation. His mother, an artist, had retreated into herself, never painting again, eventually succumbing to a long illness, her spirit broken. Elias Thorne had been silenced, his family erased, his history forgotten, his community destroyed. The boy who had grown up in the warmth of a bakery, surrounded by the laughter and stories of his neighborhood, had been cast into the cold, impersonal anonymity of Averil City. He had become one of the invisible, a shadow of his former self. He literally lived the very narrative he's now avenging, Reed stated, her voice hushed. He became the shadow that Averil City created. And now, he's projecting that shadow onto everyone he believes is responsible for its creation and maintenance. Their intel indicated Thorne had no criminal record, no history of violence, no psychiatric evaluations. He was a ghost in the system, a master of blending in. He worked odd jobs, mostly data entry, living in a nondescript apartment, paying rent with almost perfect punctuality. He was, to all appearances, a model citizen, a terrifyingly normal one. "He's been planning this for decades," Jenkins whispered, a chill running down her spine. The silent rage, simmering for 20 years, finally boiling over. The hunt began. They had a name, a motive, and a clear connection. But Elias Thorne, the Shadow Weaver, was not one to be easily caught. He was hyper-aware, meticulous, anticipating their every move. His apartment was empty, cleared out days before they found him. It was a taunt. He knew they were coming. Then came the final message. A meticulously crafted package, delivered anonymously to the mayor's office and simultaneously to the city's largest news outlets. Inside, nestled amongst more dried crimson roses, was a leather-bound journal. It contained Elias Thorne's manifesto, a chillingly lucid account of his life, his loss, and his crusade. He described Averil City as a predator in concrete, devouring its own soul, leaving behind a trail of forgotten stories and shattered lives. He detailed each of his victims, not by name, but by their symbolic significance in his twisted narrative of urban decay and neglect. He concluded with a promise. One final act, a grand unveiling, that would force Averil City to finally confront its true face. The journal also contained a cryptic clue. Where the old heart beats anew, but only shadows remain. Jenkins stared at the phrase, her mind racing. Old heart beats anew. Shadows remain. She looked at the map, at the pinpointed locations of the Old Mill District. The Old Heart, the bakery, Thorne's Daily Bread, the old Thorne's bakery site. Mac exclaimed, a sudden burst of understanding. It was demolished, but a new historic preservation building was erected there. A gallery, a cultural center. It's meant to look like the old district, but it's just a hollow shell. Jenkins' eyes widened. And it has an unveiling ceremony tonight. The mayor, prominent city figures, media. A celebration of Averil City's renewed spirit. It was Thorne's stage, his final, devastating act of defiance. He planned to strike at the very heart of the city's self-congratulatory delusion, at the place where his own family's dream had been crushed. The Averil City Police Department, alongside the FBI, mobilized with unprecedented speed. The new Old Mill Arts and Heritage Center was swarming with officers, plainclothes detectives blending into the crowd of unsuspecting dignitaries and art enthusiasts. Jenkins and Mac were among them, their hearts pounding. They scanned every face, every shadow, searching for the ghost of Elias Thorne. The lights dimmed for the mayor's speech, and a palpable tension filled the air. Then, a sudden, blinding flash from the upper balcony, followed by a deafening bang. Not a gunshot, but an explosion of distraction. Panic erupted. Amidst the chaos, Jenkins spotted him. Elias Thorne. He wasn't aiming for the mayor. He was at the center of the main gallery, standing over a large, covered sculpture meant to be the centerpiece of the exhibit. In his hand, he held a device, not a bomb detonator, but a remote. On a large screen behind him, usually reserved for video presentations, a live feed flashed on, showing images. Not images of art, but of the Old Mill District, vibrant and alive in old photographs, then slowly dissolving into rubble, juxtaposed with smiling faces of city council members from the 90s. The voices of displaced residents, taken from forgotten interviews, echoed through the hall, heartbreaking laments of betrayal and loss. Thorne was broadcasting his manifesto, not through words, but through raw, painful imagery. They built a monument to forgetfulness. Thorne's voice boomed, amplified through a hidden speaker system he'd rigged. His face, projected onto the screen beside the painful images, was gaunt. His eyes blazing with a fanatical intensity. They pave over our memories, our homes, our lives, and call it progress. But I am here to remind you, to make you see the crimson thread that binds your prosperity to our suffering. He pressed the remote. The cover fell away from the sculpture, revealing not a work of art, but a chilling tableau. Mannequins, dressed in the clothing styles of his victims, each with a single crimson rose on their chest, were arranged around a miniature, meticulously recreated model of the Old Mill District, as it had once been. The faces of the mannequins were replaced with enlarged photographs of his victims, their expressions frozen in a haunting silence. It was his final, horrifying memorial, his grand unveiling. Jenkins moved, pushing through the terrified crowd, Mac right behind her. "Thorne, it's over!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. Thorne turned, his eyes locking onto Jenkins. A flicker of something, perhaps recognition, perhaps a twisted satisfaction, crossed his face. He didn't try to flee. He just stood there, amidst his macabre masterpiece, the images of his ruined past flashing behind him, the voices of the silenced whispering through the speakers. "Over?" he scoffed, a chilling laugh escaping his lips. "It's only just begun, detective. Now they see. Now they remember." He held up a small vial. Not a bomb, a concentrated dye. He shattered it on the base of his sculpture, and crimson liquid flowed, simulating blood, spilling over the model of the Old Mill District, staining the white floor of the pristine gallery. Before he could do anything else, Jenkins lunged, tackling him. Mac joined her, wrestling the remote from his grasp. Thorne offered little resistance, his fight replaced by a strange, almost serene acceptance. He had delivered his message. He had forced Averil City to look into its own shadow. Elias Thorne, the Shadow Weaver, was apprehended. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief, but it was a ragged, guilt-ridden breath. The terror of his reign had subsided, but the questions he had forced them to confront lingered like a haunting echo. In the aftermath, Averil City began a slow, painful process of introspection. The mayor initiated a commission to review urban development policies, and new funds were allocated to revitalize truly forgotten communities, not just erase them. Martha Davies Historical Society finally received the recognition and funding it deserved. The crimes of Elias Thorne had, in a twisted way, accomplished his goal. They had forced the city to see its own past, its own neglect, its own crimson threads woven into the fabric of its progress. Jenkins, however, knew that true healing was a long road. As she stood in the empty gallery days later, the memorial sculpture dismantled, the crimson dye scrubbed away, she still saw the shadows. Elias Thorne was behind bars, but the darkness he had exposed, the collective amnesia that allowed such pain to fester, remained a potent force. Averil City was safer, but it was also profoundly changed. It had glimpsed its own reflection in the cold, unblinking eyes of the Shadow Weaver, and it was a reflection that would forever haunt its conscience. The story of Averil City, and the crimson threads that bound its past to its future, had just truly begun.